But there are so many Filipinos in the crowd tonight, so many flags. Thank you.
But something happened inside Toronto that night that nobody could have predicted. The moment Eala stepped onto center court, the atmosphere changed. This was supposed to be another WTA 1000 match. Another night session. Another step in a long tournament. But the moment the first Philippine flag appeared in the stands, it became something much bigger. Then another flag appeared. Then another. And suddenly, the Canadian crowd was surrounded by red, blue, white, and yellow. Thousands of Filipino fans had come to watch one player. Eala. A 21-year-old Filipina who had arrived in Toronto carrying something very different from what she had carried into tournaments before. She wasn't simply chasing another win. She was arriving as a champion. Just days earlier, Eala had captured the biggest title of her career at the DC Open, defeating Jessica Pegula in the final and announcing herself as one of the fastest rising names in women's tennis. But nobody knew what would happen next. Because Toronto wasn't just another tournament. Toronto was where the world was about to discover just how powerful the Eala effect had become. And the numbers were already warning everyone. Before the first ball was struck, fans were flooding into the stadium. Tickets that normally would have taken days to move were disappearing at astonishing speed. Wednesday night. A midweek session. A second-round match. And yet the demand was beginning to look more like a championship final. That should have been the first warning. The second came when the fans entered the stadium. Philippine flags were everywhere. Some were professionally printed. Others were handmade. Some fans wore jerseys. Others wore shirts carrying Eala's name. And then there were the signs. Messages written in English. Messages written in Tagalog. Messages simply saying, "Alex, we believe in you." This wasn't casual support. This was personal. For many Filipino fans, Eala represented something they had rarely seen on a tennis court before. Someone who looked like them. Someone carrying their flag. Someone proving that the Philippines could produce a player capable of standing on the biggest courts in the world. And that is where the story becomes much more interesting. Because Eala didn't suddenly become popular in Toronto. The crowd had been building for years. Back at earlier tournaments, Filipino supporters repeatedly found ways to turn quiet tennis courts into something completely different. They followed her through smaller venues. They watched early round matches. They traveled. They bought tickets. They filled sections of stadiums that were never designed around a Filipino audience. The tennis world noticed. But Toronto was different. Toronto had one of the largest Filipino communities outside the Philippines. And when Eala arrived after winning in Washington, the distance between player and supporters suddenly disappeared. For once, the numbers were impossible to ignore. The tournament had a star. And the city already had the audience. Then came the match. Across the net stood Alicia Parks. There was history between these two players. Earlier in the season, Parks had managed to get the better of Eala. But this time, something was different. The court was louder. The pressure was different. And Eala was playing with the confidence of someone who had just discovered what winning a major WTA title felt like. From the opening games, the Filipino supporters made themselves heard. Every Eala winner triggered a roar. Every long rally ended with another wave of noise. And every time she walked toward her chair, another Philippine flag seemed to rise behind her. The match became more than a rematch. It became a statement. Eala fought through the pressure, survived the momentum swings, and eventually finished the job. Same opponent. Different tournament. Completely different ending. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether Eala belonged in Toronto. The question was how far she could go. But here comes the part that many people missed. The biggest story wasn't actually the score. It was what happened around the score. Tournament officials began realizing that Eala was creating something unusual. Fans weren't simply watching her. They were organizing around her. They were creating an atmosphere. They were turning sessions into events. And that changes the economics of professional tennis. Because when one player can influence ticket demand, online attention, social media engagement, merchandise interest, and international viewership, that player becomes more than an athlete. She becomes an attraction. And Eala was becoming exactly that. Then came another unforgettable moment. Eala joined Venus Williams in doubles. Think about that for a second. On one side, a young Filipina star still writing the first chapters of her career. On the other, one of the most influential players women's tennis has ever produced. Venus Williams has won 7 Grand Slam singles titles. She has stood at world number 1. She has won Olympic gold. She helped redefine what power, athleticism, and ambition could look like in women's tennis. And now she was sharing a court with Eala. The result wasn't the ending Filipino fans wanted. Eala and Venus eventually lost. But something more important happened afterward. They spoke together. They discussed the experience. And Venus had the opportunity to watch Eala up close. Not through highlights. Not through social media clips. Not through headlines. From the other side of the court. And then came the words that sent another wave through the tennis community. Venus described Eala as a star. Not simply a promising junior. Not simply a young player. A star. That distinction matters. Because when someone with Venus Williams' history talks about the future of women's tennis, people listen. She wasn't handing Eala a trophy. She was recognizing what she believed was already there. The talent. The mentality. The personality. The ability to connect with people beyond the tennis court. And that last part might be Eala's most powerful weapon. Because tennis has always needed personalities who can bring new audiences into the sport. Eala may be becoming one of them. Look at what happened in Toronto. People who had never followed women's tennis closely were suddenly checking schedules. Families were watching together. Filipino communities were sharing match times. Fans who had never attended a WTA event were buying tickets. That is how a sports movement begins. Not with one championship. With thousands of small decisions made by ordinary people. One person buys a ticket. Another brings a flag. Someone else posts a clip. A family watches the match. A child sees Eala and decides tennis might be for them. Then the cycle repeats. And suddenly a tournament realizes it has something it cannot manufacture through advertising. A genuine connection. But Eala still had work to do. Toronto wasn't finished. After the emotional win, the schedule didn't slow down. There was doubles. There was recovery. There was another singles battle. And the pressure kept increasing. Because once you become the player everyone wants to see, expectations become another opponent. The next singles match became another test. Eala had to prove that the noise around her wasn't distracting her from the tennis itself. And once again, she delivered. The match became a physical and mental battle. Long rallies. Momentum shifts. Tight games. Moments when either player could have taken control. But Eala kept fighting. That is becoming one of the defining characteristics of her rise. She doesn't need everything to go perfectly. She just needs enough belief to stay in the fight. And the crowd stayed with her. Every difficult point was followed by encouragement. Every breakthrough produced another explosion of noise. At times, it sounded less like a Canadian tournament and more like a home event in Manila. That is what made the week so extraordinary. Eala wasn't playing in the Philippines. She was thousands of miles away. But the Filipino community had created something that felt remarkably close to home. And now the rest of tennis was watching. The story had changed. A few months ago, the conversation was about whether Eala could break through. Now the conversation was about how high she could climb. Could she win another WTA title? Could she make a deep run at a WTA 1000? Could she carry this momentum into the US Open? Those are no longer fantasy questions. They are legitimate sporting questions. And that is the biggest difference between hype and arrival. Hype asks what might happen. Arrival makes people ask what happens next. Eala has reached that second stage. And there is another layer to this story. Her rise is happening at a time when women's tennis is desperately looking for new global connections. The sport already has legendary champions. It already has established stars. But every generation needs new faces. New stories. New markets. New audiences. Eala has something very few players can manufacture. She has a nation behind her. And not just a nation watching from home. A global Filipino community willing to travel, buy tickets, fill stadiums and make noise. Toronto proved that. One match became an event. One player became a reason to attend. And one flag became thousands. So now we arrive at the real question. What happens when Eala walks into the next tournament? Will the crowds become even bigger? Will tournament organizers start scheduling her matches differently? Will sponsors begin seeing the commercial potential? Will more young Filipino athletes pick up a racket because they saw Eala competing on center court? Those questions are bigger than one result. Because sometimes an athlete doesn't just win matches. Sometimes an athlete changes what people believe is possible. And that may be the real Eala story. She isn't simply trying to climb the rankings anymore. She is changing the size of the audience watching women's tennis. She is giving Filipino fans a player they can rally around. And she is showing the tennis world that a superstar doesn't always have to come from the traditional powerhouses of the sport. Sometimes the next major tennis story comes from Manila. Sometimes it arrives quietly. And sometimes it takes one unforgettable night in Toronto for everyone else to finally notice. The flags were there. The fans were there. The pressure was there. And Alex Eala stood in the middle of it all. Still only 21. Still learning. Still improving. But no longer invisible. The tennis world has noticed. The Filipino community has already decided. And now the only question left is how far this story can go. Because if Toronto was the beginning of the Alex Eala phenomenon on this scale, then the next chapter could be much louder. And this time, nobody will be able to say they didn't see it coming.